What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. Today, we'll be going over 5 wide receivers to trade for. This is mostly looking at opportunity, who's getting a lot of targets, a lot of variance, but just hasn't been able to convert those into fantasy points through the first few weeks. We'll only be going over 5 receivers though. Actually, it'll turn into 6, but only 6 receivers today. So if you want a complete list, you can check that out at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. But let's get things started off in today's video with the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat was through the first 3 weeks. What defense had allowed the most fantasy points to the tight end position? The answer was New Orleans Saints, and Michael Collins was the first to get that one right. Today's stat, through the first 3 weeks, Mark Andrews leads all tight ends with 5 end zone targets. Who has the second most? All right, let's go over the first receiver, and that is Julian Edelman. Edelman ranks 15th in targets, 13th in air yards, including ranking first in percent of team air yards, but just 25th in points per game. And he's coming off just 2 receptions for 23 yards in a game where the Patriots scored 36. So going into that game, he was, I believe going into the week, he was either first or second in percent of team air yards, so he maintained that. But going into the week, you see, high scoring game, 36 points end up being scored. He remains first in percent of team air yards. You're like, he went off, right? No, like I said, the 2 receptions for just 23 yards in that game. Now, I don't think that he's going to be insanely cheap coming off this game or anything. It's not like everyone's like, oh, he's bad now. I mean, he just came off a career high game in receiving yards. But I have him as the wide receiver 21 for the rest of the season, and I think that's roughly what you should expect to pay for him. That's like low-end wide receiver 2 numbers, and I think that's what he's going to produce, and I think he's a solid guy to target in trades. One thing I want to point out is that the Patriots have destroyed both the Dolphins and the Raiders in 2 of their first 3 weeks. Those are 2, I would say, mediocre games that Edelman had. I believe in the first week it was like fine in a full PPR league, but definitely 2 weeks where you were a little bit disappointed with his production. And then, of course, week 2, when they played in Seattle, he had just the monster game. Of course, he far exceeded every expectation you had in that one. But because of these 2 games he had where they just dominated, they were able to run the ball a ton in those games. And while I expect the Patriots to be good this season, I don't expect them to just steamroll a bunch of teams. They'll be in far more competitive games than the 2 blowouts in 3 games indicates. So Edelman should be in that 7, 8, 9 target range most weeks. And given that, like I said, he ranks first in percent of team air yards, it means that he has a much higher ceiling than we're used to seeing. Especially in matchups, like I said, where they need to throw the ball a ton. Because in past years, when they get into these matchups, we're like, okay, Edelman can have a good game, but he's going to need like 10 targets, 11 targets to be really valuable in fantasy because he's probably only going to catch like 7 of those for 70 yards and maybe he'll score. But this season, his targets are coming much deeper downfield. He has a 12.4 average air yards per target this season compared to just 9.2 in 2019 and 7.7 in 2018. So he's getting looks deeper downfield, so he doesn't need 10, 11, 12 targets. But like I said, in games where they're very competitive, his ceiling is so much higher than we're used to because those targets come so far downfield this season. And that's going to raise his weekly ceiling, and it's not something people think about. We've known Edelman for so long. Everyone thinks he's just a low ADOT guy. His targets are not coming downfield, but that's not true this season, so it'd be smart to capitalize on that before people start to realize it. Next up, we've got Odell. Odell ranks 24th in targets, 12th in air yards, but just 43rd in fantasy points per game. I'm sure you all saw his quote from last week where he said that he doesn't expect to put up the kind of numbers that we're used to seeing from him since this is a run-dominant offense and they are very, very good at running the ball and at using their running backs, I'll say, in the receiving game, but mostly Kareem Hunt. And while that may be the case, he is still getting a little bit unlucky and he has had some tough matchups. I mentioned avoiding him both in week 1 and week 3's wide receiver cornerback matchups video. and he did have a dud in both weeks. So we knew going into the week. It wasn't like we're looking back and saying, oh yeah, that was a tough matchup, but we thought he was going to do well at the time. We knew going into weeks 1 and 3, these were very difficult matchups for Odell. We did not think he was going to have a good game. So we're not shocked that he performed poorly. And this week, he gets one of the best possible matchups. And Odell is one of those players who has such a high weekly ceiling that when he gets into these explosion spots and he does hit, it's going to be a month before you can trade for him again, right? Because he'll have some mediocre games, but if he goes out there and he posts 150 and 2 touchdowns, you're not able to trade for him for at least another few weeks after that. So I want you to be cognizant of that. The Browns are facing Dallas, and this is a team who seems to think that defense is optional. They've allowed the second most fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position, only behind Seattle. And a side note on that, it is truly incredible how bad Seattle has been defending wide receivers. I know they've had 3 brutal matchups, and so that number is inflated because when you play offenses that have incredible receivers and you're in shootouts, you're going to be bad at that stat. But I believe they've allowed like 73 points per game to wide receivers, and Dallas is second most at like 48. So there's a huge gap. Seattle is just putrid at defending wide receivers, but so is Dallas. And so no one on that team is capable of slowing Odell. So while they will still definitely try to lean run heavy, they're not going to run it every play, and they are going to be effective when using Odell. So I think this is a spot where he's had some mediocre games. People are a little bit upset. But listen, the volume's there. 24th in targets, 12th in air yards, but 43rd in fantasy points per game. And part of that is also the touchdowns. I know we did have the 1 touchdown in week 2, but it's worth noting that that was the only touchdown the Browns have thrown to a wide receiver, and they've scored 10 on the season. That's not something I expect to continue. I think that wide receivers are going to count for more than 10% of the Browns' total touchdowns on the season. And given that Odell is pretty clearly the top option when they get into the red zone among wide receivers, I have to think he's got a much higher touchdown ceiling than we kind of seen so far this season. So I think that's an area where he could see positive regression. And if he maintains this volume, he's going to be much more valuable than the fantasy production he's shown thus far. Next up, got to go over my boy Jerry Jeudy. You probably didn't really expect this one, but Jeudy ranks 16th in targets, 15th in air yards, but just 55th in fantasy points per game among wide receivers. And the thing is, now that Sutton is done for the year, he's just the clear number 1 wide receiver in the passing game. I know a lot of people are high on KJ Hamler. I personally think there's a chance Hamler has a more productive fantasy season down the line. I really think that this season, Jerry Jeudy is going to be the best wide receiver on the Broncos. And so having a wide receiver 1, he's not like a wide receiver 1 fantasy, but a top wide receiver on a team who is extremely talented. We all know going into the draft that he was one of the 2 best receivers in that draft class. It was either CeeDee Lamb or Jerry Jeudy. There's a ton of debate on which one's going to have a better career. It probably will come down to quarterback play, but both of them were extremely talented. And so this is a fantastic wide receiver, gonna get a ton of targets, a ton of air yards. I mean, like I said, he ranks 15th in air yards, 16th in targets. That's very impressive for your first 3 games of your career, especially when 2 of them were against the Steelers and the Bucks. And he's also been really consistent. It wasn't like he had 15 targets in one game and he dropped down to 2 in another. He's had at worst 7 targets in a game. He's never been below 4 receptions, never been below 50 receiving yards. So while he hasn't just gone off yet, again, tough matchups. First 3 games of his career being this consistent is pretty nice. And he does get to face both the Dolphins and the Jets in 2 of his next 3 weeks. So I have him ranked as a top 30 wide receiver for the rest of the season, which you can see at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. And I think that he'll cost you less than that. So it's not like I think you're going to actually be able to pay like the wide receiver 55, but I think that you can get him for like flex or high-end bench value, and I'd be comfortable starting him in the flex moving forward, and he's just going to get better and better as the season goes on. So you probably want to trade for him now before he gets really good. Next up, we've got DJ Moore. Moore ranks 11th in targets, 6th in air yards, but only 34th in fantasy points per game, in large part because he has 0 touchdowns. In fact, he's one of just 5 wide receivers in the top 35 in points per game not to have a touchdown, which was an issue that I did bring up this summer. But we noted that, yes, he hadn't been used a lot when they were getting close. Yes, his touchdown upside is capped, but we went over how the Panthers last season had the lowest passing touchdown percentage in the league at just 44%. And since that stat isn't really sticky year over year, we thought that maybe they'd have some positive touchdown regression towards throwing. So not that they were going to score a bunch more total touchdowns, although we did think that would happen, and I do think it is going to happen. But we thought that they ran for such a high percentage last season, maybe they throw for a few more this year. So far, that hasn't happened. They rank second to last in that exact same stat, throwing for only 2 total touchdowns on the season thus far. It's only through 3 weeks, and so there's a ton of variance there. But I would say that's your one concern, is that they were last in that category last season. They're second to last this season. It doesn't seem like they're throwing for that many touchdowns. Maybe that happens a little bit more now that McCaffrey is done for about a month, but a little bit of a concern there. I would jump on the other side and say, yes, he's probably only going to have like 5 or 6 touchdowns this year, but he's on pace for 75 receptions, almost 1,300 yards. Again, he ranks 11th in targets, 6th in air yards. So he's getting the targets. These targets are coming deep downfield. It's only the touchdowns. And so in a standard league, maybe you don't target him in trades, but I hope none of you actually play in a standard league. For all other formats, I think he does see enough volume. He is talented enough. And again, this was Teddy Bridgewater's first 3 starts. Like, they're going to develop a little bit more of a chemistry as we move further into the season. And so he's already been really productive. He's been getting a ton of volume. If that's going to increase, if their chemistry is going to increase, I think this is a time that it'd be really smart to buy low, especially given his next matchups, home versus the Cardinals, and then at Atlanta. That game's going to shoot out. Both of those games are just great environments for fantasy production, and so he should have 2 really solid weeks. The last player we need to go over is AJ Green, but this one is more of a discussion point than saying that like you need to get Green at all costs, but I'll talk about that. So there are signs pointing to Green as the number 1 top target this week for trades. He ranks 7th in targets, 2nd in air yards among all players, yet just 78th in fantasy points per game. A split like that is nearly impossible to achieve. You know, getting that sort of volume, those air yards, and being 78th in fantasy points per game, that's just like unheard of. No one's that unlucky, right? And so either he's getting more unlucky than I've ever seen and he's about to explode, or he's cooked. You know, maybe he's just not good anymore. My take is that it's something in the middle. He's for sure not the same AJ Green that we knew back in 2015, 2016, but we knew that coming into the year, right? We knew he was going to be less effective than we're used to seeing from him. But while he has had 3 brutal matchups in a row, there's no way he's getting this unlucky, you know, and you can see it in the games. He doesn't look right. I'm not saying he's hurt. I'm saying that he doesn't look like AJ Green. You know, he's just not getting open. He's not really winning those contested catches. And the question becomes, do we care? Right? Like, okay, he's not that great anymore, but if he's going to keep seeing the 2nd most air yards in the league, he's going to keep seeing the 7th most targets in the league, then he's a buy. You know, it doesn't matter if he's bad now. That sort of volume needs to be on your roster for as cheap as he's going to be in the trade market. The Bengals are also averaging the 2nd most pass attempts per game, and while I don't think they're going to throw the ball 47 times a game, we talked about that to start the season. That's why I said Joe Burrow's a really nice late-round pick, because he's got a ton of weapons around him, and they're going to throw the ball a ton. That's not stopping. They're going to be probably top 5 this season in pass attempts. And so you look at AJ Green, you're like, why isn't he the number 1 target? I think that T. Higgins is going to be better than a lot of people think this season. I had him ranked much higher than most people were willing to, had him as a deep sleeper. I just think he was going very overlooked in Dynasty. I think he was going overlooked in general, a large part because of his draft capital. You know, he got that second round draft capital, but it was the first pick in the second round. And so no one lumps him in with guys like Lamb and Jeudy and Rager and Ayuk. Ruggs, was that the last first round pick? Justin Jefferson. Those are all the first round wide receivers. And so no one lumps him in there, but he went a few picks behind some of those guys. It was effectively the same draft capital. And he had a fantastic career in college. We talked about how they won so many games basically at halftime in his final season that he went off in the first half, but they didn't even need to use him in the second half because they were winning by like 30 points. And so I think he's a very talented receiver. And while I don't think he's going to come in here in week 4 and just completely overtake AJ Green, he only played 15 snaps in week 1, but went up to 60 in week 2, 58 in week 3. He made John Ross a healthy scratch in week 3. He was out snapping AJ Green in both weeks 2 and week 3. He gets the touchdowns in week 3. He's getting productive with his targets, whereas Green's not being productive. I just think there's a very real chance that in the next few weeks, we see a divide. We see AJ Green come down from ranking 2nd in air yards, 7th in targets, more towards the middle of the pack, and a lot of those targets and air yards go to T. Higgins. And if that's the case, then Green is a mirage as a buy low. You know, from far away, it looks like he's the perfect buy low opportunity, but he's not. The real buy low might just mean go get T. Higgins off free agency, put him onto your roster, and just see what happens, instead of trying to trade away a bench player for AJ Green, because AJ Green still has name value. And that name value is still going to cost you something in the trade market. But T. Higgins is free. You know, I have him in 2 out of 4 leagues, and the only reason I don't have him in all of them is because the bench spots are a bit thin in some of those leagues. And so when you only have 5 bench spots, you know, and one of them's taken up by Christian McCaffrey hurting his ankle, you just can't. But if I had 8 bench spots, even 7, if I had 7 bench spots in every league, I'm pretty sure I'd have T. Higgins in all of them. That's how talented I think he is. That's how much opportunity is available on this offense. And so we're not buying low in AJ Green. We're adding T. Higgins. If you wanted to trade for him, you could, but it'd probably be a little bit dumb. Someone probably just added him off free agency this week, and they see 2 touchdowns. They're not just going to give him away. So I think if he's on a roster, you probably don't want to trade for him right now. Maybe wait, see if he has a few bad games. But add him off free agency. So I think he's going to have a really nice close to the season and a really good career. So those are 5 receivers that I would be trading for this week. If you want a complete list of all wide receivers and all running backs you should be trading for, as well as some tight ends sprinkled in this week, you can check that out at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. That's the end of this one. Hope you all did enjoy. If you did, how about hitting the like button? And how about subscribing to the channel if you're new? But thanks for watching.